I wanted to kind of set the stage and kind of pull this all together, or hopefully wrap it all together by telling you what your pork checkoff dollars have done to date, and how we're really building the sustainability program at National Pork Board to do exactly what Scott said, to tell the story about what you're doing every day and tell it in an effective way. Let's get started here as we go. You know, I think one of the biggest pieces is that we know that the U.S. pork industry is part of the solution. We do things every day on our farms across the U.S. That are sustainable, but we haven't done a good job telling that, and we're making a change. We're making sure that we can know that quantifiably and be able to tell that story. So we know that we provide a lean, quality, nutritious protein for families here and around the world. We improve soil health. Think about our utilization of manure. And we do it all with a low impact to the environment. In fact, if you think about checkoff research, your checkoff dollars that have invested in research, you know, we know that we have contributed 75 or utilized 75% less land, 25% less water, 7% less energy, and 8% fewer carbon emissions. So those are great stats, and I think we can all agree there, right? That shows a powerful story, and with the help of Susan here and our communications team, we tell that story every day. But that's not enough. We have a lot of questions coming from our supply chain partners, from the conservation community, from other governments, from other countries about what we do every day and what we're going to do, frankly, going into the future. And so even up to 15 years ago, pork producers were really on the forefront of this topic. You know, Scott couldn't quite say the S word yet, but pork producers came together and created the We Care platform and the 6 ethical principles that underlie that platform. And as you can see, they're very holistic in nature: food safety, animal well-being, public health, environment, our people, our communities. Because that really is, as Scott said, you have to have the economic pillar along with the social pillar, along with the environmental pillar to be able to talk about sustainability. And that foundation has now led to where we are today. Recently released We Care goals and metrics back in January. And those 12 goals and metrics are our commitment as the U.S. pork industry of what we're going to do tomorrow and into the future. And when we pull that information back and can talk about the progress towards those goals, that's going to be an even more powerful message than even that 60-year look back that talked about the 75% less land, et cetera. And one of the things I've learned from Marisa and Dr. Carter Ingram, who we also work with, is that process is really important when you're thinking about goals and metrics. So one of the things that the pork producers did, you know, not only 15 years ago when they worked on the We Care ethical principles, but also in this latest process of creating goals and metrics, is they said, we're going to lay out a process that builds the credibility of what we ultimately develop. And I think that is really important because in this space, credibility really is maybe the name of the game when it comes to it. And so a lot of the things even Marisa will talk about gets back to integrity and making sure it has the confidence and the scientific backing that it needs. So during the process of developing the goals and metrics, one of the things that happened or that was recognized was an assessment of key market and societal value drivers. That led to prioritization of social and environmental issues for goal setting, identification of ambition levels, and then ultimately deciding what was right for the U.S. pork industry. One of the things that's important about that first point about that assessment is the recognition of, again, going back to the why. Why are we doing this? Why do we have a We Care platform if we understand what we're doing and the continuous improvement efforts that we do is really great. Why do we need this? Well, we do need it because there are wants and desires of our consumers and our external stakeholders around the world. And we need to know, and the pork producers who came together on that task force to develop those goals recognized that they needed to know what were those wants and desires and questions. I call them questions that are being asked about our product, and then how can we ultimately shape those into goals? Because those, you think about it, that's the ultimate purpose of the goal. It's to drive continuous improvement towards those and be able to talk about it, but it doesn't have the impact of providing that confidence that we want in consumers if it's not answering the question that they most care about. So that's why that assessment was so important, and was really, the pork producers, I was very impressed when I came over and watched them kind of go through this process because of that recognition, that it wasn't just about what was right for them as producers, but what was going to be impactful to consumers here and around the world. Because ultimately, we want to be able to sell more Scott's pork, not only here domestically, but around the world. And so when you look at the goals and metrics, you'll notice that they do go through, of course, the entire supply chain. They cover all 6 of those ethical principles. And that, of course, is part of sustainability as well. We can't do this alone. We do need our supply chain partners to work with us in this process, and how we have built it does in fact do that as well. So in the end, you can find those goals and metrics at porkcares.org in our 2021 sustainability report. And so those are all listed there. Everyone, they're publicly available, so you can share that link around as well. But we also have to then take the next step, right? The natural question is, we have a goal. How are you going to get information? What are you going to report on, right? And so that is the important next step. So what we have built with our pork producers is to invest checkoff dollars into creating an application that actually utilizes existing data sources where they're available, finding others, filling any gaps that we need to fill, and ultimately being able to produce reports for the producer, reports at the state level, and aggregated reports at the national level on those goals and metrics that we can then turn into the narrative, right? Coming back to the beginning, that is the ultimate goal. And so this diagram or this infographic quickly kind of explains it or puts it a little bit more into context. So we have the goals and metrics database, as you can see right there, if I was taller. And then to the left, 2 ways to get data into the system, and I'll back up so you can see, sorry about that. Individual farmer entry, and then existing data sources. And then if you break out that existing data source, you have internal data systems, might be in your farms and ranches right now, external systems. That might be a program where you have provided your data and it's stored somewhere else. If you think about site assessment, and we have sustainable environmental consultants here in the room, those on-farm reports, which I'll touch on too, that data is stored somewhere else. And with the right permissions, we can already take those existing data sources and match them with those goals and metrics to ease the burden on you as producers. So those existing data sources, so I mentioned sustainable environmental consultants, WAVE. There we go. See, we got a few of them in the room. We work with Jenny and Ann to develop these on-farm sustainability reports. So they really are the report that comes back to you for your farm and your operation. And it holds a lot of information. So you work very quickly with them. It doesn't take that long. And it produces a simple 2-page report that really holds a lot of information, from things like greenhouse gas emission to carbon sequestered per acre to your erosion rate. And it can really hold some pretty powerful data, not only for you as the operator, can utilize it as a decision-making tool, but also with landowners, lenders, and others possibly, because it is kind of that next level of management. And if you think about from the national level or even from the state level, what's the kind of the value that we can get there? Well, same thing. We can aggregate those numbers together and tell a pretty powerful story, right? We can have talk about how many tons of carbon the U.S. pork industry sequesters. We can talk about the amount of reduced CO2e that we have contributed, and put that in terms of passenger cars, perhaps, that your conservation practices have contributed to. So you can tell. And whenever I'll give you a quick example. You take something like this to maybe one of our supply chain partners that doesn't have access to further down their supply chain. It can be a pretty powerful story to slide over just a 2-page report that says, this is what the U.S. pork industry is all about. This is what we're doing, and that can really change some hearts and minds about the efforts that we're making on farms. So they do hold a lot of value, both individually as well as at the state level, at state and national level. So far, just to give you a quick update, we started kind of this project as a pilot. We're now at more than 250 farms participating, 250, so 250,000 acres and 2.4 million pigs represented in the system. And again, we kind of just started opening it up. So welcome everyone in the room to get your on-farm report if you haven't done so already. Scott has done it. He did it in the pilot phase as well as since then. So you can see it. It's at porkcheckoff.org. And like anything else, there are continually enhancements being made. And one of those is including what we call the carbon footprint calculator. And that's really digging deeper into that carbon footprint based inside the barn, right? So talk about things like feed. Feed is such an important piece, right around 50% of our carbon footprint. So understanding where we are there, understanding at an operation level where you are, can be really important to showing that continuous improvement. So hopefully I've provided a good overview of some of the programs that your checkoff dollars have been invested in that's going to produce outcomes that we can translate into a narrative to provide confidence in the pork products that you produce, not only here domestically, but again, around the world. And I'll leave you with this. Can you guess what the biggest, probably the number one question I get about from the on-farm reports when people get their report back or I'm talking to them about them? Any guesses of what that might be, considering the name of this session? Is this a carbon credit, right? So you saw some of those numbers, sequestered per acre, total amount of reduced CO2e, right? And so that's kind of a natural thing that comes in, and it's a third-party verified program. Well, while the answer is simply, no, it is not a verified carbon credit, it is the first step anybody that happens to be interested in entering a carbon program should take. It's much, it's more than just about carbon, of course. It's got water in there. It's got, all your conservation practices. But if you are interested in taking that next step into the carbon programs, it can give you a lot of valuable information about your operation and ideas of what you might do going into the future to improve those outcomes ultimately. So that, of course, is why we wanted to preface Marisa's talk about that. But there are a lot of questions out there about carbon markets. What should I look out for? What should I look for? And knowing that and hearing that as your National Pork Board, we decided to work with Pollination Group, who has a lot of experience in this space, and get some of those questions answered. So Marisa is working, and Pollination Group is working on an educational piece for pork producers specific to carbon markets. And she's going to share, it's in draft form right now, but we are getting close to finishing it. And she's going to share a preview of some of the main points that have come out of that work in looking at carbon credits as they apply to the U.S. pork industry. So with that, Marisa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Happy to be here. I actually grew up in Iowa, so my mom's happy I'm here too. I grew up in Northwest Iowa, Spencer. My folks are here now, though. So Ashley, you set it up well. What are carbon markets, and how can the ag sector benefit from them? And I think we're going to go through a couple things just to provide a little bit of a context for what are carbon credits, what are carbon markets, and then dive into what the agricultural sector could benefit from in those areas, and then talk about opportunities and challenges. So we're going to start broad, and then we'll drill down to be more, I think, applicable to your specific ag situation. So on the overview, I would say the agricultural sector, the carbon markets are not new. They've been around for 20 years. I think they're newer to the ag sector because they haven't really expanded to include ag-related activities in large part until more recently. So I think people are hearing about soil carbon sequestration, about other things, and so it seems like they're new, but they have been around, and we have been doing them for a while. Not a lot of people are listening to them, but recently they have been increasing significantly. So just to take a very scene setter here, what is a carbon credit? We're using that to be synonymous with carbon offset as well. So basically a carbon credit is equal to a metric ton of carbon dioxide reduced or removed. So a reduction example is a reduction in fertilizer that has a benefit, like you reduce your application through doing certain practices. There's a benefit based against business as usual. So you would normally have put X amount on, you reduce that, that differential between business as usual and the reduction is you can get carbon credits for that. An example of a removal is the soil carbon sequestration. So if the carbon you do cover crops, you would sequester soil carbon, that's the removal of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that you can quantify into a carbon credit. This is oversimplification. There's lots of details we'll get into, but that at a very basic level is what a carbon credit is. It's not something, it's just a certificate. It's a paper certificate that you trade and you can have that benefit of claiming that you're reducing or removing carbon dioxide. And the whole purpose of the carbon markets is to channel finance to activities that would have not otherwise occurred. So if that fertilizer reduction wouldn't have occurred, but for the carbon credit, that's a way to be able to fund some of these activities that are good for the climate, good for soil health, good for other reasons, where you wouldn't have to put up your capital to do it, on your own. So that's the purpose of the carbon markets. And how they're used. So they're used in two different areas, and we call them compliance carbon markets or voluntary carbon markets. And on the compliance side, these are rules, these are requirements by governments that high emitting sectors have to reduce their emissions. So in general, the ag sector is not included in these as entities that need to reduce emissions by law. These are mostly focused on, power sector, oil companies, high emitting manufacturing industries. The government says you have to reduce your emissions and you can buy allowances, which are like permits to pollute, or some of them also allow for the purchase of offsets or carbon credits. And that's where ag comes in. They can benefit from creating these offsets and selling them to the compliance entities. So an example of the compliance markets is there's one in California. A cap and trade program is another word for those. There's not one nationally in the US, and there's also one in the Northeast. So that's compliance, that's like required reductions. The other thing where we're talking about more, and I think is more applicable here, is the voluntary carbon markets. And this is like, people call it the Wild West of carbon markets, where it's not created by law. It's basically just driven by corporates, largely, taking on voluntary climate targets. So a corporate, Google, says I want to be net zero by 2030. And so to do that, they need to decarbonize their operations. But if they can't decarbonize completely, they can buy offsets. And so that's the voluntary market. It's driven totally by voluntary demand. And they're administered, so the markets themselves, not administered by governments, they are administered by NGOs, private entities, companies that have created standards and methodologies where you can do that measurement of carbon. They issue credits, you trade on a registry. So it's all just kind of driven by voluntary demand. An example of that is the voluntary carbon standard. So on the compliance side, this is a picture of all the compliance markets in the world. So you can see there's a lot of them. There's 68 pricing initiatives. This is carbon taxes and cap and trade programs. And so the US has, you can see California, and then in the Northeast. Most of the developed countries, you can see, have some sort of carbon pricing. And in the last year, there was a record 84 billion raised by governments. They're selling those allowances, getting money from the corporate or the high emitting sectors. Again, ag is not included normally in these as someone who has to buy the credits, but they do participate in them by selling the credits to the covered entities. And you can see the 23% of global emissions are covered by carbon pricing. I think most people, scientific experts, think that's not enough. So I think there is going to be a push to expand these to be covering more of global emissions. So on the voluntary side, it's also increasing. It's harder to track because they're so disaggregated. No one has to say how much they got for a carbon credit. If you sell a carbon credit to a corporate, you don't have to disclose it anywhere. You don't know the volumes. It's all kind of ad hoc a little bit. So it's harder to track, but we do know based on voluntary reporting that this last year exceeded $1 billion in carbon credit transactions on the voluntary side. So a lot less than the $84 billion on the compliance side, but still, considering it's a voluntary thing, $1 billion is quite a bit. And to date, so this is driven by corporate demand again. To date, they've been very lightly regulated. The government, again, is not controlling it, but the government, now that things are scaling up and there's $1 billion and expected to grow by tenfold by 2030, the government now is kind of like sniffing around, like how can they regulate it? What can they do to make sure that people aren't being defrauded or misled or something like that? So you can see a couple of the government entities there. The SEC is thinking about how they do that. In that case, you can trade derivatives off of carbon credits, so they're thinking about how they regulate that. The Federal Trade Commission is also thinking about how they should regulate claims made by carbon credits. So if you're a producer and you sell a carbon credit and a corporate buys it, what kind of claims can each party make with respect to their climate impact? And the Federal Trade Commission has very old guidance on this point. They're the same people who would regulate what you can call organic or what you can say is biofuel fueled or whatever. So there's some sense there. And then the Commodities Futures Trading Commission is also thinking about regulating it. So in terms of numbers, so ag-related carbon credits are considered in the nature-based solution area. And so of all global credits issued last year, nature-based solutions are about half, so 45%, which is quite a bit. So there's a lot of demand and a lot of interest in nature-based solutions in particular. There's also interest in renewable energy, is RE, so and that's not in the US, that's in developing countries where that's generating credits, and also waste, energy efficiency, you can see the rest. But the point here is just nature-based solutions are very popular and constitute half of all global credits. And that's increasing, so that was up from 31% a year before. And then diving into that 45%, you can see that most of the 45% of the nature-based solutions is forestry. So all the blue, avoided conversion, avoided deforestation, afforestation is all forestry related. The teal in the 5% and the 3% is the ag percentage. This is global again. So that's ag carbon sequestration, so like soil carbon, or reduced emissions, which is like that fertilizer example. And so it's small, but it's up from 9%-ish now, and it was up from 1.76 in 2020. So we see there's like, the growth is significant here. And so how do you create a carbon credit? Like we've been talking about them, people are buying them, but how do you actually create it? And some people may know this, people might be selling them here, I don't know, but the first step would be to determine what activity you can do, and is that activity eligible under a standard? So if you want to do a biodigester, you can find a standard that would be able to credit those reductions from that, covering your manure and piping the gas through a biodigester. Or soil carbon, there's a list of eligible activities that you could look up and see what kind of credits you could generate. You would then, if you found that your activity was eligible, you could then register with a standard, which would be one of those bodies that issues the credits in the voluntary world, or on a compliance standard. Or you could sign up with an aggregator. And an aggregator is someone who just takes a bunch of small projects and puts them together and then represents those projects to the standards body. So if you do soil carbon on a small farm, it's not worth all the rigmarole to have to register and deal with the standard and all that stuff. So normally those types of projects are collected by an aggregator, and then they do all the back end work. So once you register, you would then implement the activity. You would then wait, probably a year at least, and then you would verify the activity with a verifier. You'd be issued credits, and then you sell the credits on the registry. Very simplified, but something to point out is that you do have to implement the activities, get them verified, and then you get paid. And that's it seems kind of simple, but that's important for a lot of people because that means your money is up front, and you have to wait until the benefits are actually verified and the credit sold for the money to come back, unless you can structure a different way, but that's the typical process. And then you would repeat that each year, or however you want to, how long your project is. And so an important part of carbon credits in compliance markets and voluntary markets is that they have environmental integrity. And this is important, obviously, to help combat climate change, but it's also important for people generating carbon credits because it comes back to the price you get for a carbon credit. If you have a junk credit that you're selling, someone might buy it, but the price is going to be pretty low. If you have a high integrity credit, you probably get a higher price, which can funnel back into your farm and your production. Another issue is that if you have a bad credit, it's sold to a corporate who claims it. People find out that it's a bad credit. There is some reputational risk that could come back down to the corporate, to the person generating the credit, and there also could be some liability risk too. So in general, we want environmental integrity for many reasons. What that actually means is what the carbon market is trying to figure out. There's lots of different aspects of what that means. But we thought it'd be worthwhile in this discussion to go through a couple of them, because these are terms that you would hear for any standard or any methodology or any aggregator that you would talk to. So the first one is that the carbon credit is real. Seems kind of obvious, like, yes, it should be real. You shouldn't be selling something fake. And that's important because you want to make sure that the reduction actually happened or the removal actually happened, because in some instances, a person buying that credit will then emit, right? So they need to balance out. They're buying a reduction so they can continue to emit. And so if you don't have that reduction to be real, then the emission happens and you're worse off from an environmental standpoint. And this is hard to say because it's hard direct sampling's hard. It's just hard sometimes to actually make sure that those credits are real, especially in ag that we'll talk about later on. The next one is that it's additional. And this is one that a lot of farmers, I think, have grappled with because this is basically that an emission reduction or removal from a project, it's additional if it wouldn't have happened but for the carbon revenue from the carbon credit sale. And these differ by methodologies, but if the activity is already common practice, if everyone in your county is doing something, it's probably not going to be additional for you to try to do it and get carbon credits. If it's required by law, it's not additional. So it has to be something that is going to help the climate more than if it hadn't been, that revenue hadn't been there. And this is hard for farmers who maybe they were early adopters of climate smart practices like cover cropping or whatever, and now they're trying to get carbon credits. It's difficult with some programs because they'll say, well, you've already been doing it. This isn't a new practice. And then in other areas, if everyone else is doing it, you can't now say you want to do it and get carbon credits. So this is one that's very difficult for some people to navigate. And then permanence. So permanence is that the carbon reduction or removal actually stays reduced or removed. And the issue with nature-based solutions is that they can be reversed. You can protect a forest and get carbon credits. If that forest burns down, all of that carbon you sequestered and got millions of dollars for just went up in the air. Like, what do you do? The climate is worse off, right? And so there's a permanence issue. And it's a very specific thing for nature-based solutions. So something like soil carbon, it has a risk of re-release. So say you did your cover cropping, but then the weather came in and there was it released the carbon based on the next measurement. Like, you have to be able to show that you're managing that risk of permanence. And that's one issue with ag credits and nature-based solutions in general that needs to be managed. There are ways to manage it. A common method is to have a buffer account where basically if you generate 100 reductions, but there's a risk of reversal, they'll hold back 25%, for example. So then if there's a reversal event, there's a fire that released 5 tons the next year, they just take 5 tons out of the buffer. And then you don't owe anyone any money, you don't have to claw back those credits. It's all good for the environment. So that's one way to do it. There's different methods on this, but permanence is a big issue. And then that the carbon credit is verifiable. So again, you have a baseline, and then you implement your activities. And if you can't verify that there was a reduction or removal that happened, then you can't get the credits. And those verifications happen by third parties. You pay for them, and they go through all the requirements of the methodology to make sure that it's verified and real. And there's some issue here, I think, there's a lot of data that happens with all of these projects, and there is some concern about where that data goes and who has control of it and how it's being managed, because farm data in particular can be sensitive. And so that's one thing that we've heard from in the ag sector that you want to be careful of, and just make sure that you know how your data is being managed. And then lastly, you don't want the carbon credit to result in leakage. And this is just that, say you make reductions in this area, and it just pushes activities over here that have the same amount of emissions. So net, you're the same off. So you want to make sure the activity is accounted for and doesn't require or push things into a different area. And the example here is if you improve practices but yield is reduced, so you have to farm additional areas that have emissions, then you kind of haven't had a benefit from the climate standpoint. So that's the context globally, kind of writ large. This is, next section is more to talk about how US agricultural markets in the sector could be, the overview of that and how it could be applicable for the US sector. And so just to make a note, under the Biden administration, they reinstated our participation in the Paris Agreement, and he also increased our goal. So our goal is 50%, 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030, and net zero by 2050. And so this is the requirement that's pushing a lot of demand. So all that corporate demand, all the government demand on those carbon pricing programs, it's being pushed, and the demand is coming from the Paris Agreement, because all of those countries are party to the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement makes you make reduction goals and then show how you're going to implement them. So a lot of the demand is coming from that. And so I think this has resulted in the US looking at all of their sectors to see where can we get reductions, because we need to make our reductions to be able to say to the international community that we're in compliance with Paris. So as you can see, the majority of US emissions are from electricity, transport, industry. Ag is not on that list. I think ag is not normally the target of required emissions. It's 10% of national greenhouse gas emissions. And really, I think the government sees ag as an opportunity for reductions and like voluntary carbon credit, basically, and carbon finance and other activities to help reduce emissions without having regulatory and required reductions, which is a good thing. You don't want to be on the side of having required reductions generally. We've talked about a couple ag-related project activities, but here's a list of some that are common ones that I think are where the government and the voluntary market is seeing that could be opportunities for reductions. So reduce fertilizer, no-till, cover crops, things that increase organic carbon, also improve manure management, biodigesters. These are probably commonly known. And just to talk about how those two compliance markets I mentioned in the beginning actually intersect with the ag world, is that the California Cap and Trade Program does not cover ag as a required entity, but ag can sell into that market. So there's two different compliance protocols to generate carbon credits in California, and they can be from all over the U.S. Even if you're selling into California, the projects can be nationwide. And that's manure management, covering manure, putting it through a biodigester, or rice cultivation. To date, there has been no rice cultivation, which is not as much as relevant here as it is in California. And most of the manure management has been from dairy farms, not from swine farms, for whatever reason. And these protocols have been around for maybe a decade, so there just has not been uptake for whatever reason in the swine farms for this particular opportunity. As credits increase in price, which they are, it may become more, the economics change where it could be more beneficial for producers to think about whether this is an opportunity. There's another cap and trade program on the Northeast called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That's about 10 states in the Northeast in the US. They also recognize ag digester projects, but they've had no offsets created to date. So, and this is why the voluntary markets are such an important piece for the ag based offsets. So similar to the clients markets, we have and similar to the global markets that we talked about in the beginning, the US carbon markets have also had a huge increase. You can see the blue, the bottom line of the chart is agriculture. And these are generated carbon credits. So 2019, 0, 2020, 0.3, and these are million tons of carbon dioxide. And then a huge increase, 3.4. So the percentage is quite high, even though it came from a very small amount. So it might look a little more dramatic than it is. But you can see that the forestry land use went from 36 million to 115 million tons just in 2 years. So everything except for energy efficiency, or at least forestry and ag, are on the upswing. And I think that's because people are really focused on the story behind carbon credits, especially in ag and forestry. They like the connection back to the land, they like the co-benefits of biodiversity. You're getting the carbon credits, but you're getting all these other things too, improve soil health, et cetera. So I think that has really driven a lot of the increase in ag-based and forestry in particular. And I will just mention the demand for removals in particular, so the soil carbon projects of the world, where you're actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it. Same with like reforestation, where the trees are pulling the carbon out. Those have been increasingly popular, and I think we'll see that there is a price differential between removal credits and reduction credits, just because people are, as they decarbonize, these corporates need to offset the emissions they can't otherwise abate. So if they have 100 million, there's nothing they can do about it. They just are going to emit that. They're going to offset those with removals. And so that's where a lot of the focus, I think, on soil carbon in particular has happened. And speaking of soil carbon, I think that's one where it's been like very in the press, and there's lots of new people participating in it. And I think there's a lot of promise, and I think there's a lot of scaling in carbon markets in soil carbon that is possible. But there are still some environmental integrity issues. So going back to that additional permanence, all those things in the beginning, the soil carbon is still trying to figure out some of those issues. But the demand on those removals from corporates is what's pushing all this innovation in this area. And it's really resulted in a lot of new market entrants, a lot of new methodologies, new technology for sampling, other things that is really exciting, I think, for the ag sector, because of the fact that you can potentially do a practice that's good for your farm anyway, or for your soil health, et cetera, and be able to generate a soil carbon credit. And so I think while there are some issues with release and measurement and things like that, and we can talk a little bit about that in the next section, I think there's a lot of potential. I think some of those issues are probably solvable. It's just a challenge at this moment. And I think the market in general is going to, and corporates in particular, are pushing for more robust measurement and methodology, so that'll push the market towards that. So just the last section here, opportunities and challenges, and this is getting into like how could people engage, like what does it mean? Like what do you actually do to engage in the carbon markets? How do you do it? And I'll have to say, having been in the carbon markets for a long time, the ag world and the soil carbon world in particular is its own thing. It's not taking the normal path. I think there's some frustration with the old path for the agricultural sector because of issues with measurement and verification and things like that. So there's been a lot of exciting innovations there. There's some potential challenges there they have to figure out, but it's taking and so it's hard to understand. And I think it's coming from someone who's been doing it for a while. I can't even keep track of all the new announcements, the new entrants, the new technologies. It's just like a deluge of information. So these opportunities have different requirements on location, minimum acreage, allowable practices. What do you have to do to sign up? What's the contract that you sign? That's different. Record keeping, data privacy, and data sharing. So it's a very producer-specific determination, which I know isn't that satisfying for everyone, because they want to know, like, well, what should I do? But this next part of the presentation is kind of to provide some guidance as to what the questions you could ask and what are kind of the overarching areas where you could engage. And I would say in each opportunity, it basically requires an analysis of the costs. I mean, costs are obviously a huge part of any business, including in the ag sector in particular. And you have to balance the cost of engagement versus the revenue generated. I mean, you're not going to do these practices just, I mean, it'd be great, but to be kind to the earth, like you need to do them, you need to be paid, you should be paid, you're helping the US meet its climate target. So, but this has to be managed as to what you need to do and what you get for that. And another issue I'll talk about is just the claims that can be made. I mentioned it a little bit in the beginning. And these are like, what are you selling when you sell that carbon credit? Like, what can you say once you've sold it? What can the corporate say? But what can you as a producer say? If you have a biodigester, you reduced, you know, 1 million, or that's too many, but 1 million credits last year, but you sold that to Google. Google now has the right to say that they reduced that because they own that claim. The only thing a carbon credit is a claim to that reduction, right? So you sold that claim to that corporate, they can claim it, and you get the money. So you're getting money for that claim. But, so what can you say? You can't, as the producer who sold that credit, you probably can't say, I reduced 1 million tons as well, because that's double claiming, right? You can't have two people claiming the same thing. That would run afoul of FTC and other things and just be misleading. You can say, I have a biodigester on my farm. You know, there's quantitative, you know, not the quantitative part, but just the actual empirical data that you have a biodigester. So this claim section is a real big issue for everyone who's participating in the market, and it's evolving. I will say there's guidance that came out earlier this week on what corporates should say and what producers should, or, you know, sellers should say. And I think that's one area that we'll get more information on and more guidance as we go. But right now, that is somewhere that I think there's a lot of questions around it and not too many answers, unfortunately. So there's 3 different areas that we talk about with opportunities to engage with the carbon markets. One is just to engage with the established standards bodies. So these are the people that I've been engaging with for a decade. They've been around. Verified Carbon Standard, I think, has done hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion in credits. Climate Action Reserve and American Carbon Registry are based in the US, are a little bit smaller, but they're well established, long history. They have robust methodologies. They're accepted in compliance markets. A lot of buyers are comfortable with them. These are like the old guard, basically. And you can see a couple protocols there. But the downside of the old guard is that they're a little bit slower. They haven't adopted as quickly some of the methodologies, like on soil carbon. Climate Action Reserve is a little bit different. They did adopt one recently on soil enrichment, you can see there. And actually Indigo Ag participated in helping move that through. They're an aggregator. It's also expensive to develop protocols. So under these programs, if you don't have a protocol that fits, you can make one, it costs $100,000. Or something like that. It takes a year. Like, most people can't do that. So they're slow to kind of move to the next thing. There's also high transaction costs to develop the protocol or even to open a registry account. They do all the checks on you, KYC stuff. It's like a bank. I mean, most people, farmers, don't need another thing to do like that. And the option is to go through an aggregator to do that. But it's difficult. I think it's a barrier to entry for a lot of producers, I would say. But that's like the normal route, I would say, to date. But there's new opportunities in the ag markets, and this is unusual, I think, in the carbon markets in general, is that there's all these new entrants, and I think a lot of them are focused on soil carbon. And I think these are just an example. There's a ton more, and I think, like I was saying, every time you turn around, there's a new one. And that's driven again by this corporate demand for their voluntary targets and the credits that they need. And so some of these are standard bodies where they're kind of like the old guard, but new guard. They'll issue credits, they have methodologies, but they're doing blockchain or they're tokenizing, or they're doing like the new Internet 3.0. And so they're jumping ahead on some of that technology, but still using methodologies. Some of them have a different approach to methodologies where they don't require certain things. They have shorter contract durations, different permanence requirements, different additionality. They're just kind of disrupting the market a little bit. They have different things on transparency. I mentioned the blockchain. I think on the risks in this world, where it's exciting to see like this disruption, it's just less tested. So these entrants are new. Some of them haven't even been issued credits yet. So it's less widespread. They're not accepted in any compliance regime, which is kind of like a stamp of approval. There's less buyers just because the buyers are still trying to figure out what has environmental integrity and what doesn't. And so they still kind of are a smaller size. And there's no market sentiment yet on the integrity of these types of credits. So very important, I think, to push the market. Still kind of a lot of questions around how they'll be accepted. And then the last section, I would say, or last category, are these corporate initiatives. Again, this is just, there's a lot more than this. These are just some examples. And these corporates are corporates with ag supply chain or exposure in agricultural markets that are seeking opportunities with farmers in their supply chain mostly. And some of them are utilizing aspects of carbon programs, but they're not completely. So they might require monitoring, verifying, impact measurement. They may not unitize the reductions into actual credits that they transfer. Some of them pay for practice rather than performance. So if you do row cropping or whatever they've asked you to do, cover crops, you can get paid rather than having to monitor and measure the actual reductions, put it on a registry, and get paid once the credit sells. Some of these have different approaches around additionality and permanence. And while these can be appropriate for some producers, there is a little bit more limited because it is you're selling to one, or your reductions and your impact is going to one buyer rather than the whole market of buyers. There are some advantages and disadvantages to all these, I would say. So just, I think, two more here. On pricing, I think this is an important part because, so you do all these things, you get the credits. What's the actual price you're getting? And pricing varies very widely based on if you're selling into those compliance markets like California, or if you're selling to a Google or a Microsoft in the voluntary market. In general, they're negotiated between the buyer and seller, so they're not disclosed. There's not just a registry where you could see all the prices. There's a registry where you trade credits, but there's no price discovery on that registry. So you would only see it if you were party to that contract or you somehow knew what the price was. You can see in agriculture is at the bottom line on this chart with the price. So there was no reported reductions in 2019. 2020, the 0.3 volume went for $9 a ton. And then the next year went for $1.36. Again, these are just, because the voluntary market's all disaggregated, these are just reported prices from people who participated in the survey. This is the broadest survey in the US. But that price is quite low in my experience. I mean, I think there's a wide variety of credit prices. And removals in general will trade higher because of that net zero push. Compliance offsets generally trade higher. Also credits with a story, like that's why the ag sector, I think, will have a better price. They contribute, have all these co-benefits, can trade higher. So there's lots of different issues there. And I think you would only know, I mean, if you're engaging directly with a buyer, you would know the price. Some aggregators guarantee a floor price, and then there's a revenue share if they get more than that floor price from a buyer. And so these are sorts of things that you would look at if you were approached by an aggregator or you were interested in looking through different opportunities in the carbon market. So these are kind of summing up all the things you should think about if you're thinking about getting into the carbon markets. Your project, and ensure they're creditable. Think about the contracts you're signing up to. Second, the implementation of the project. Do you need to go through an aggregator? Can you upfront pay for the practice, or do you need to have consider the timing of finance from when you implement it and pay for it and when you get the money back? Verification. Are you paying for verification? Is the person you're contracting with paying? What is the data privacy and sharing precautions? For measurement and reporting, you have to balance the ongoing monitoring versus what's required, for reversals. And what happens if there's a reversal? Are you on the hook? Is the buffer credit canceled? This all differs based on the standard. And then the sale of credits. Are you the one selling the credits? Is the aggregator selling the credits? How are you engaged in that? And do you want to be doing that? These sorts of things. So lastly, I would say that's all on carbon markets, and carbon markets might be great for a lot of people, but there's lots of other things to do to monetize climate smart activities. And there's a list here. There's financial incentives in the form of renewable energy certificates, low carbon fuel standards, green bonds, incentives, government incentives, all sorts of things. So carbon markets might work for particular activities and particular areas, and people who are comfortable with that, but there's lots of other ways to do it as well. So I don't want to leave people thinking that's the only way to get funded for doing climate smart activities. There's lots of other ways as well.